Cette conférence va maintenant être enregistrée.
Okay. Okay. Okay, I see. I see how it works. Okay. So, thanks for those who are here, and welcome to this course on moral cognition. I planned for a course for about an hour and a half. I won't take the 2 hours because I don't want it to be too dense. So first of all, the way I want to introduce this is first presenting a little bit a very important point, which is that this is a very new field and it's growing since approximately the 90s. So a lot of what I'll present to you is very uncertain, despite some of the very assertive claims of some of the researchers on the field. And so the point is we don't actually know that much about how human beings think and act morally. But I'll still try to present you the main concepts and results which have appeared since the 1990s, especially since I'd say 2001, 2004. And first, before just jumping into the heart of the subject, I just want to take an evolutionary perspective to try and define what morality is, what we actually mean by morality, and trying to go beyond, the simple definition of it's simply the ability to distinguish right from wrong. And so the way I want to introduce this is first talking about Charles Darwin, who I think you all know is the founder of the theory of natural selection, evolution by means of natural selection. And so, as I think you know, this is a theory which explains how life on Earth evolves through time. So you have organisms which compete for scarce resources and which are selected based on their fitness, which is their adaptability to the environment. And they transmit their traits, heritable traits, to their offspring. And so the organisms which are more adapted to the environment will transmit more of their traits to the offspring. And this is how life on Earth evolves and changes over time. And so this is a very popular theory, but there are a lot of misconceptions about it. And one of them has to do with the place of competition in natural selection. And so you have several people who have interpreted the theory of Charles Darwin as depicting a very cruel world where you have lots of competition and lots of fighting over animals for very scarce resources. And so you have quotes like that of Lord Tennyson, "Nature red in tooth and claw," or quotes such as this one from Andrew Carnegie: "While the law of competition may be sometimes hard for the individual, it is best for the race because it ensures the survival of the fittest in every department." And this is wrong. Well, this is partly wrong because it it really misses a big important point about natural selection and the theory that Charles Darwin conceived, which is that natural selection is based both on competition and on cooperation. And this is true all over the kingdoms of the living world. You may have cooperation between species, for example, but it's especially true for social species, and since human beings are social species, it's especially true for us. And this is actually kind of obvious because you see in the real world that most human interactions involve a mixture of competition and cooperation. And it can be very simple stuff like, I don't know, you're going, for example, in economic transactions, when you pay for something, the cashier expects you to give real money, and you expect that the cashier is going to give you what you paid for. This is a very basic form of cooperation. For example, what I'm doing right now, teaching you about something, we're all cooperating because you're paying attention, and I'm taking some time to transmit some kind of knowledge. And you may have more extreme and very altruistic forms of cooperation. This is a picture of someone saving lives at sea. And so you might wonder what this all has to do with morality, and this is linked to morality because if you think about it, a lot of moral laws and a lot of morality is actually very social. If you go back, for example, to the first moral codes, you have a lot of laws that concern how you're going to interact with the people. So, for example, a lot of moral codes will prohibit killing, stealing from someone else, lying to someone else. And so the consensus today among scientists, among the people who work on this, is that morality promotes cooperation. So it can be seen as a device to enhance cooperation between individuals that may behave more selfishly. And so this is a very useful way to view morality as this device that evolved through time to promote cooperation between human beings. But it's there's a little twist actually there are several little twists. First of all, morality can be used for other things, and you might also wonder how certain moral laws that we have today or certain moral behaviors might be linked to social behavior. You have people, for example, that consider that eating certain foods is immoral, and it's not very obvious in how this is linked to any social life. But here, when I say that morality evolved as a means to promote cooperation, I'm not saying that it can be used. It can't be used for other things. And one of the common analogies for this is your nose, which evolved as a way to smell things, but it can be used, for example, to wear glasses. And it's very likely that noses didn't evolve as a means to wear glasses, but you can wear glasses with your nose. And so this is what's thought of morality. It's a bit of an analogy. It can be used for other things that aren't necessarily obviously social. So here I have a little video just to show you that there are a lot of results that suggest that morality is something that is a bit innate and that is very ancient in our evolutive history. And so this is a video about an experiment from Franz de Waal, who's a primatologist who worked on those questions of morality in evolution in our ancestors and our close cousins. And so he did an experiment with I think those are, I don't remember what kind of animals they are, but Anyway, I'm going to show the video, and so it's an experiment to show that there are forms of morality in animals. So yeah, I'll just launch the video, and you can see for yourselves.
We can't hear the sound. I think you haven't been sharing the sound of the video.
Oh, you can hear the sound? Okay, how am I going to... there's a problem. Oops. Yeah, well, let me just... I'll put the video in the chat, and you can just... It's very short. It's 2 minutes, so you can just watch the video, and let me just pull the link. Okay. So here it is. Okay, so tell me when you've watched the video, and I'll go. Okay, so yeah, it's a pretty funny video. You don't really expect that kind of behavior from those monkeys, and so yeah, it's to really illustrate the point that it's very likely that morality, or at least some of the constituents of morality, have evolved and have kind of an ancient history, and that it's not something that is purely human, but that appeared most likely in our ancestors, our primate ancestors. And so one of the other twists about this morality as a device to promote cooperation between members of the same species is that if you remember, I showed you this little, group of human beings, but it would be kind of wrong to assume that the whole of humanity is just one big group of human beings that all interact with each other. Especially in the early age of humanity, the groups can, a group, for example, in Africa can really communicate with the group in Europe, because we didn't have, all this globalism that we have today. So we had different groups of human beings that were scattered around the world. And those groups were actually competing with each other. So some of them were cooperating, but some of them were also competing. And that's also the case today. If you look, at groups like nations, for example, some nations cooperate with each other and some nations compete with each other. And so morality not only evolved as a device for in-group cooperation, but also for inter-group competition. So people in the same group cooperate with each other, and people from different groups often compete with each other. And that's where it gets interesting. And that's also where we get most of the issues we have today. And I'll make this very obvious point, but with some illustrations just now. But there are several groups today that compete over moral issues. And so here, for example, I have an illustration from, this was a poll that was made by the Pew Research Center in 40 countries, where they asked people what they thought about several moral issues, such as extramarital affairs, gambling, homosexuality, and they plotted those results. And so they asked each respondent whether they thought that, for example, having extramarital affairs was acceptable, unacceptable, or not a moral issue. And so here you can see that there are several differences between the issues in question. So, for example, extramarital affairs are often seen as unacceptable, and contraception use is often seen as acceptable. But this is a mean over the 40 countries, and if you actually look at the differences between countries, you have huge differences. So, for example, here it's the the views on homosexuality ranked with the least tolerant country at the top and the most tolerant countries at the bottom. And so you have, for example, a majority of people from Ghana who think that it's unacceptable to partake in homosexual behavior. And you have kind of the opposite in Spain. And so you have those huge differences in moral views, not only between countries, but also, for example, between religions. This is a poll with results on abortion, which show that Protestants are more opposed than Catholics to abortion in certain countries of South America. We also have differences between political parties. And so the point here is really that you have all these differences, all these different groups with hold different views on several moral issues. And this is often a real problem. So just to show you some examples in the real world, which might not be as obvious when you just look at numbers, people really hurt each other over those issues and get really emotional. And so it's something that is very important for many of us. And so I'm talking about all of this just to introduce what's at stake here. A lot of people that work on this moral cognition don't simply work on it because it's interesting, and it is, but they also work on it because they believe that studying moral cognition, so studying how people think and behave morally, might help to resolve those kind of conflicts. Because if you understand how people might acquire certain moral issues and why we have different moral issues between different groups, then maybe it can help us find some solutions. And of course, studying moral cognition might have also other benefits, which I'll talk about towards the end of the course, such as understanding moral and criminal responsibility or moral pathologies, such as psychopathy. And so this is really to illustrate that studying moral cognition can have very concrete and practical applications in the real world. And this is true for most science, but it's especially true for this field. So before really diving into the results, I'll just say a few words about the approach of, the cognitive approach of the study of morality. And so this is a little diagram that we showed in the very first course, illustrating the interdisciplinary approach of cognitive science, which is, at the intersection of psychology, computer science, neuroscience, and all of these other fields. And so here I'll mainly talk about 4 of them. So philosophy, psychology, computer science, and neuroscience, and show how the study of moral cognition is really an interdisciplinary approach where very different approaches are used to tackle this problem. And it's also a descriptive approach, and this is, as opposed to what we call normative ethics. So what we mean by ethics is the study of morality, and philosophers often distinguish 2 main fields. So you have descriptive ethics, which is a study of just describing how people act and think morally, without necessarily focusing on how they should act. And normative ethics is really the opposite. It's studying how should people act and think. And I'll actually talk about this a bit more towards the end of the course. We talk about a descriptive normative gap, which is important to have in mind because going from just describing how people act and think morally to how they should act and think morally is not obvious at all. And so this descriptive prescriptive divide is often illustrated by those 2 people in the literature, and actually there's some confusion about those 2 philosophers. So here you have Kant at the left and Hume at the right, and often they're pitted against each other. And some people view them as descriptivists, others view them as more normative, and there's also this. It's often viewed as a fight between reason and passions and emotion, because Kant was more, about rational philosophy, and Hume wrote about the passions. But if you actually look at the work, Kant was really more of his work was very normative, so prescriptive. He really wrote about what a true moral theory should be, and how people should act. So he thought that there was, this imperative of using reason and justifying your moral view with pure reason alone, without considering the emotions at all. And Hume, in the case of Hume, is a bit more complicated because his work mixes a descriptive with a prescriptive approach, but it was mainly descriptive. So he thought that people were actually making moral judgments based on emotions, but he didn't really touch on whether that was justified or not. And this is also to keep in mind, especially when reading literature. Some people make a lot of confusions on this, and often to make very caricatural points. I'll touch on this towards the end of the course too. So now I'll really start talking about some of the results, the really interesting results that have been found in this field of moral cognition in the past 20 years. And I'll first talk about what we call moral intuitions. And I'll try to show you some results that suggest that a lot of moral cognition is actually automatic, unconscious, and largely emotional. And so first of all, I just want to start with something very basic. So if you try to think about what are the constituents of our moral machinery, one of the most obvious things is that, well, a lot of human beings have care and empathy towards others. And this has been shown by several psychology studies. And I want to talk about this study that showed that we have an aversion to harmful actions, and that really actually goes beyond just a psychological aversion. And it's a really interesting study where, so it's a study by Fiery Cushman and colleagues that was done in 2011. And they took participants and they told them either to perform a false violent action. So, for example, to hit a leg. So, in the picture you see here, this is actually a false leg. So they gave participants hammers, and they told them, "Well, hit this leg as hard as you can." They told them it was a false leg. They did the same thing with the smash hand or the smack baby, for example. So people would take a false baby and smack it on the table. And so they either asked the participants to perform those actions or to witness them. And what Fiery Cushman did is that in addition to that, he measured what's called he basically measured vasoconstriction on the skin of the participants. And so the important thing to know here is that vasoconstriction is often a sign of stress. And so that they measured that, thinking that, well, if people perform or witness a violent action, there's going to be a stress response. And so their peripheral blood vessels are going to constrict in both conditions. And so that's actually not really what they found. What they found was that, so this is a graph showing you what's called total peripheral resistance, which is a measure of vasoconstriction. So the higher it is, the higher your stress response is. And so you can see that, so in the no harm condition, those are just control conditions where the participants had to perform a non-violent action, such as cutting bread, for example. In the witness harm, so when participants just had to witness the actions, there was actually no difference with the control. But when people had to perform violent actions, there was a stress response. And that's interesting because participants knew that their actions wouldn't have any consequence. So it's not that the aversion to harmful actions is because you know that your action is going to have bad consequences. There seems to be an innate stressful response to just performing what's typically known as a violent action. So here, for example, if you're going to hit a false leg, you're going to have a stress response, even though you know that it's not going to have any bad consequence, just because the action of hitting another human being visibly triggers an innate stress response. So this is a first constituent of what you might call this moral machinery. We have automatic responses, stress responses, to just performing violent actions. And so actually a lot of the work on moral cognition has focused on also the role of emotions in moral judgment, also in moral behavior. And before talking about those results, I just want to introduce what's called the moral foundations theory, which is a very useful theory for classifying morality that I'll use in the following slides. So this is a theory that was conceived by Jonathan Haidt, who's a very known researcher in this domain of moral thinking. And what he did was try to classify moral beliefs into what he calls moral foundations. And he came up with those 6 foundations. So care, harm, fairness, cheating, liberty, oppression, loyalty, betrayal, authority, subversion, and sanctity, degradation. And according to him, all of your moral beliefs and all of the moral beliefs you can think of can be classified into those 6 foundations. And so this is a very useful tool that's used throughout the field to study different types of moral beliefs and transgressions. And this has been used a lot in the study of emotions. And so the first study I want to talk to you about is a study where by Franchin and colleagues, where the authors came up with a set of transgressions either in the harm domain or the purity domain, and they tried to see what kind of emotions it would elicit. And so you have here two examples of those scenarios, those transgressive scenarios. So people had to read those scenarios, and then they were filmed, and the authors would just look at the faces and analyze what kind of emotions they would read on the faces. And so you have, those are a bit weird sometimes. So the first harm scenario is someone kicks a dog in the head hard. And the purity scenario is one of the examples is someone signs a piece of paper that says, "I hereby sell my soul after my death to whoever has this piece of paper." And what the authors found is that those two types of transgressions actually trigger different emotions in the participants. So here you have a little graph that actually summarizes this. They looked at anger, disgust, contempt, and smiling, so amusement. And they plotted the frequency at which those emotions appeared in people, either when they were reading a harm transgression or a purity transgression. And they showed that those two distinct types of transgressions elicit, so for example, harm will elicit more anger and more contempt than purity transgressions, whereas purity transgressions will elicit more disgust and actually more amusement too than harm transgressions. And so this is summarized by this little graph that I took from the study, where you have distinct moral categories that are associated to distinct emotions. And so, for example, harm here is very exclusively associated with anger. So people will be more angry if, for example, they see a scenario where there is harm done. And purity is more complex because it can elicit anger, disgust, but also amusement. And that might actually be linked to the fact that the scenarios that the participants were reading were actually sometimes a bit weird. And so they were smiling because it was just often comical, those kinds of scenarios. And so this is to show that we seem to have emotional responses that are tailored to our moral sense, that are closely linked to our moral sense. And actually, a lot has been done on specifically on the emotion of disgust. And I'll show you a study that people have made that shows that not only do we feel disgust when we hear about or see a transgressive scenario in the purity domain, but that eliciting disgust can actually modify the way we're going to make that moral judgment. So first of all, I just want to quickly talk about the way that this disgust is seen by scientists today. So the emotion is actually divided into three subtypes. So you have pathogen disgust, which is being disgusted, for example, by disease, which might be linked to evolution because its function might be just to prevent disease. So you're going to be disgusted by something that is sick because it might help you avoid contracting the disease. There's sexual disgust, and its evolutionary function is thought to be to optimize evolutionary fitness. So scientists think that you might actually be disgusted sexually by some people because it's a way to prevent you from not optimizing your fitness. And then there's moral disgust, which is the disgust that is elicited by just moral scenarios. But what people have shown, and this is what I'll show you in this study, is that actually all types of disgust, and even disgust that is not necessarily moral, can influence your moral decision. And here, this is a study by Schnall and colleagues made in 2008, where they took participants and they, for example, they placed them in situations where they would feel disgust. So, for example, they would put participants in rooms that would be not clean or very disgusting. And then they would submit those participants to moral judgments. So they would give them the same types of scenarios as I showed you before. And then the participants had to rate those scenarios as either perfectly okay or extremely wrong on a scale from 0 to 9. And here what you see is what were the acceptability ratings of people either in disgusting rooms or just in normal rooms. And what you see, so here at the high end of the y-axis, the higher the number is, the more wrong the people will judge the scenario, and the lower the number is, the more okay they will judge it. And you see that, so this is a mean. People will judge scenarios as more wrong if they are in a disgusting room than if they just are in a normal room. And they actually tried this with several different ways to induce disgust. For example, they would put something that smelled really bad just near to the participants. And so here the key idea is that they try to make it such a way that participants wouldn't actually consciously associate disgust with what was surrounding them. So it was pretty subtle. Participants actually didn't know that the room was intentionally disgusting. And so what I thought is that the participants were actually associating the emotions they were feeling right now to the scenario they were judging. And that's why they were judging as more wrong in the disgust condition than in the no disgust condition. And this is to show that, and there are several other studies that show this, that you can manipulate moral judgment by manipulating emotions, which seems to suggest that there is a causal relationship between your emotion and what your judgment is going to be. So this is to illustrate that emotions might have a very big role in moral judgment. Now, a final aspect of our moral machinery I want to talk about is tribalism. So I told you that morality likely evolved as an in-group competition cooperation device, but as an intergroup competition device. And this has been also studied. So tribalism is, the fact to have an in-group favoritism and to, dislike other groups. And this has been a lot studied by what's called the implicit association test, which is a test that you can actually take online, I think. You usually have those two types of screens, and it's a test that's designed to see if you have automatic preferences to certain groups as opposed to others. So, for example, the test might be designed to see if you have an automatic preference for European American people as opposed to African American people. And so the way it works is that they show you, this little face, for example, of a European American, and then they're putting at one side of the screen European American are good and African American are bad. And so, for example, if they flash this little face, you have to click on the left because it's European American are good. And they might also flash a word that is classified as good, and you have to click on the left, and so on. And so you have two conditions where you either have European American associated with good, African American associated with bad, and then you have the opposite, African American associated with good, and European American associated with bad. And what people have shown is that you might have different responses in one condition as opposed to another. So there are a lot of either white people or black people that will respond faster. So, for example, if you're a European American, you will respond faster if European American is associated with good and African American associated with bad, because that's the kind of unconscious stereotype and unconscious prejudice you might have about those groups. And so if you see African American or good and you're not used to seeing this association, you will actually respond more slowly and have a more difficult time classifying what you see on the screen than in the other condition. And so if you take the test, so you have your little result here, for example, suggesting that you have no automatic preference between European American, African American. And a lot of people actually have strong preferences for white people compared to black people, for example. And actually, that's the case for white people, and for black people, it's the opposite. They will have faster responses. They will have more strong preferences towards black people than towards white people, and this has been interpreted as an illustration that we tend to have favoritism towards the group that we belong to. And this can actually be also illustrated by our differences in moral beliefs. And so people have tried also to study how the group we belong to will be associated to moral beliefs, and if you can classify groups according to moral beliefs, and that's actually the case. And so this is a study that was done by Haidt and Graham in 2007. I'm sorry. And so here you have 5 of the moral foundations I told you about, and they try to see if different political parties, so either liberal or conservative, would be associated with different moral foundations. So they asked people from either of those political parties to rate the relevance of each of the moral foundations in moral decisions. So, for example, they would ask if harm should be relevant to moral decisions, and they would have to rate that relevance on a scale from 1 to 6. And they found that liberal people, which is the plain line here, actually care more about harm and fairness, and not so much about in-group authority or purity. And conservative people will consider all of those moral foundations to be on the same level. And that might explain why there are such differences between liberals and conservatives, especially in the United States, because they might actually consider that there is literally a big difference in the way we have to consider what is relevant when making moral decisions. And this goes actually further than that. And there are people that showed that the group you belong to might predict the belief you're going to have more than other things that we might consider intuitively as more important for that belief. And so here more concretely, there's a study that was done by Kayan and colleagues in 2012 where they asked people how much risk do you believe climate change poses to human health, safety, or prosperity? And they wanted to see if you could predict what the people were going to respond based either on their scientific literacy or on the group that they belong to. And so, for example, a prediction you might make is that people that are more scientifically literate, so that might know more about science, will rate climate change as being high risk, and people that don't know that much about science might rate climate change as being not that risky for humans. And so this is illustrated here, where the prediction is that you have a relationship between scientific literacy and how you're going to perceive climate change. And they actually found that that was not the case. So it appears that overall, there's not that much difference between people that know a lot about science and people that don't know a lot about science. And the other analysis they did is then trying to separate people into 2 different groups. So you have hierarchical individualists here and egalitarian communitarian. And so here, just for the sake of the argument, they more or less correspond to liberals and conservatives in the United States. And what they actually showed is that with just knowing what group you're in, it's a lot easier to predict what you're going to answer to that question. And so they showed that egalitarian communitarians, so liberals, were going to perceive the risk as great, and that it was the complete opposite with conservatives. And so this is really to illustrate the point that there seems to be a lot of tribalism concerning certain moral issues. Now, a few caveats to take for this study is that it was done in the United States on a very specific moral issue, which is, climate change. Some may not see it as moral. Some may see it as moral. This has been interpreted as being the case because, the issue of climate change has been very politically polarized in the US. And this might be why you have such strong group preferences, where a whole group is going to have one single moral belief and the other group is going to have another moral belief. And so all of this, tribalism, the fact that we seem to have automatic responses, unconscious, emotional responses that might shape our moral judgment, might suggest that we're just stupid, and that we just act based on our emotions, that we don't really use reason, that reasoning just serves as a post hoc justification, so just to rationalize the judgment you made based on your emotions. And that's actually the view of Jonathan Haidt, who is at the origin of the moral foundation theory. And so he's a partisan of what's called social intuitionism. And he really believes that, moral judgment is automatic. We just judge on emotions, and we really don't use our reason when judging things. And, there are a lot of studies that actually go his way. So the studies I've shown you, and another study I just wanted to talk to you about because it's very interesting about post hoc justifications and how people might come up with reasons for their choices, but those reasons are completely, false and confabulations. There was a study done by a group of people on this issue where they would show two pictures to participants. Then they would ask participants to show a picture, and then instead of giving them the picture that they had chosen, they would give them the other picture. So the picture they had not chosen, and then they would ask them, well, why did you choose that picture? And if you saw that you were given the wrong picture, you would say, well, that's not the picture I've chosen. But they made it so that people wouldn't actually really see that the pictures were swapped. It was pretty subtle. And they wanted to see if the participants could come up with reasons for having chosen that picture, even though they hadn't chosen that picture. And they found some pretty, insane stuff. So, for example, they actually had a spectrum of confabulations across participants, where there were participants that would actually report the truth and give the reason they had chosen the picture. And that was actually the reason they had chosen the picture, but they didn't actually notice that they were shown the picture they had not chosen. So they had pictures of two women. One was smiling, one was not. And so, for example, there were participants that chose the picture of the woman that was smiling. They were given the picture of the one that wasn't smiling, and they would say, "Well, I chose her because she was smiling," which is true, and is evidently not why they would have chosen this woman on the left, because she's evidently not smiling. And there are people that are going to make up completely, false reasons, and just confabulate and come up with reasons explaining why they had chosen that picture, even though they hadn't. So, for example, here you have at the the far end of the spectrum. So someone who was given who had chosen the picture on the left, and he was given the picture on the right, and he said, "She's radiant. I would rather have approached her at the bar than the other one. I like earrings." And he's saying this even though he has not chosen that picture. So there are other examples. I've put the references here that show that people often make up reasons justifying their choices, even though there were evidently not the reasons they had based their decisions upon in the first place. And so this is called the "people are stupid" school of thought. This is an idiom from a researcher called Killstrom that noticed that in some fields of psychology, people assume that we are irrational, on automatic pilot, and that we simply don't know what we're doing most of the time. And it seems very counterintuitive, and it almost seems obvious that it's really not how that works, because even from our everyday lives, it seems that there are some instances where we make decisions based on reasons, and that we use our reason to make those decisions. And so now I want to show you some studies that actually give some place to reason, and that show that this isn't that simple, that we just we don't just make our moral judgments based on the group we belong to or based on our emotions, but that there is an interplay between emotions and reason in morality. And so I'm going to talk about two studies that were really landmark studies on this subject. And first, to introduce this, I want to talk a little bit about dual process theories in psychology, because the theory I'm going to talk to you about is a dual process account of moral thinking and moral judgment in human beings. So dual process theories are very popular theories in psychology. The originator of those theories is actually Daniel Kahneman, who is a Nobel Prize in economics. He wrote a book which is a bestseller. You see this book cited a lot by people in the field. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. And the basic idea of those theories is that you have two systems in the brain. You have a first system, which is the fast system. It's often called the hot brain. It's a system which is, effortless. You don't have control over it. It's more like your intuitions, your automatic responses. So that would correspond, to the system that I talked about, the emotional system of human beings. And then you have this second system, which is a slower, the cold brain, which is the conscious system. It's based on effort, it's based on reason. And so you have this very, binary separation between the very emotional, unconscious, automatic brain and the rational and slow and patient brain. And so this is a kind of caricature, and it doesn't really work that way in human beings, but it has been kind of useful to study not only more of psychology, but a lot of psychology actually during the last decades. And so now it's really not that used in research, but it has been a very, very influential way of seeing things in the past. And that's actually the way of thinking that Joshua Green, who I'm going to talk to you about just in a minute, used to think about how to think about morality in the brain. So here I'm going to talk to you about two studies that were done in 2001, 2004 by Joshua Green, he's a researcher at Harvard. He did those two studies in the laboratory of Jonathan Cohen, who's also a very known researcher in the field of psychology. And those two studies actually, paved the way for much of the research today on the cognitive neuroscience of morality, because it was really the first time that someone used techniques as fMRI to study how we made moral judgments. And so before diving into the results, I just want to talk a little bit about the techniques that he used, because those are techniques that are used throughout the field and that are very popular to study moral judgment. And so in those studies and in a lot of studies, people use concepts from what is often called trolleyology, which is a term to group all the moral dilemmas that rests on a basic moral dilemma, which is called the trolley dilemma. And so this trolley dilemma is very simple. So imagine you're standing next to an incoming trolley, and you're next to a little lever that you can pull. And if you pull that lever, the trolley is going to switch tracks. And so you see that trolley incoming towards a group of 5 people. And you can make a choice. So if you don't change tracks, the trolley is going to just continue on its course and kill those 5 people. But if you switch the tracks and the trolley is deviated from its original destination, then it's not going to kill 5 people, but it's going to kill 1 people that was, on those opposite tracks. And so often in those studies, participants have to say what they would do in this situation. So either they pull the lever and they kill 1 people instead of 5, or they do nothing, but 5 people die. And so this trolley dilemma was used by Green in his 2001 study with another dilemma, which is a bit different, which is called the footbridge dilemma, where this time you have to imagine that you're on a bridge, and you have a trolley incoming this time under the bridge, and it's still going to kill 5 people. But if you push someone off the bridge, it's going to stop the trolley, so it's going to kill only 1 person, and those 5 people are going to be safe. And so if you just think in terms of numbers, those 2 dilemmas are equivalent, because in the 2 cases, if you do nothing, 5 people die, and if you take an action, 1 person dies. But the main difference between the two dilemmas, and it's the difference between what Green calls the impersonal and personal moral judgments or dilemmas, is that in the first case, you just have to pull a lever. And in the second case, you have to perform an action. And, as I've showed you, people are averse to physically harming people. So people don't have aversive reactions to just pulling a lever, but they do have aversive reactions to pushing people. And so often people are going to make different judgments on those type of dilemmas. And we can classify the judgments that they're going to make in either utilitarian or non-utilitarian. And so those are concepts that come from philosophy. So utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. It's a focus on the consequences of actions, and non-utilitarian can be also seen as deontology, is when you focus on actions themselves. So those are 2 normative philosophical theories that give you guidelines on how to act morally and how to judge moral dilemmas. And so, for example, in the trolley dilemma, if you flip the switch, that's an utilitarian judgment because you're focusing on the consequences of your action. So you're saying, well, if I kill 1 person instead of 5, well, it's going to be best because it's better to have just 1 person dead than 5 people dead. But if you don't flip the switch, then you're a non-utilitarian and you're obeying to deontology, which says that the act of killing someone is wrong. Regardless of the consequences, it's wrong. So you shouldn't pull the lever. So there are people who think that you should not pull the lever because it's going to kill someone, and you should just not act because if you don't act, 5 people are going to be dead, but then you won't do anything morally wrong. And what's interesting is that most people make utilitarian judgments in the trolley dilemma, so they choose to pull the lever. And most people make non-utilitarian judgments when faced with the footbridge dilemma. And at the time, it was really not understood why people made different choices in the two cases and how that translated in the brain. And so that's where Joshua Green started trying to understand this difference between different types of judgment between those two kinds of dilemmas, even though the consequences are the same. So what he did was take participants and give them those two types of dilemmas, and he would subject them to fMRI. So the last course was an fMRI, so you can check it out to have more information about it. Here, for the sake of the course, the only important thing to keep in mind is that it's a method to measure brain activity by tracking changes in blood flow. So Green would, monitor the brain activities of participants when they were making those moral judgments. And this is the results he got. So those are the brain activities those are the brain regions that are activated by the footbridge dilemma as opposed to the trolley dilemma. And what he found was that in the footbridge dilemma, those brain areas that were activated were brain areas that were associated with emotions. So what Green concluded from this is that personal moral judgments activates areas associated with emotions, and so he thought, well, that must be why people are making different choices in both of the cases, because in the personal moral judgments, in the footbridge dilemma, people are going to have an aversive emotional reaction to the action of pushing someone. And so that's going to activate brain areas associated with emotion. And so they're going to be more reluctant to kill a person than if they just have to pull a switch. And so according to him, he started thinking, well, maybe deontological, moral judgments are based on emotions, and utilitarian judgments are based on reason. And so you have those two systems in human beings that give rise to different types of moral judgments. And so the obvious also hypothesis that you can make on this is that, well, maybe you have a conflict between those two systems when you make a moral judgment. Maybe you have a conflict between what your emotions tell you and what your reason tells you. And so in his next study, that's exactly what he tried to show, that you have a conflict in personal moral judgments, so in moral judgments that trigger emotions, between what your reason tells you and what your emotions tell you. And so to do this, so first he replicated the results from his 2001 study. So he studied impersonal versus personal moral judgments. And then he focused on those moral judgments, on those personal moral judgments, and further classified them into a difficult personal moral judgment or an easy one. So for example, an example of difficult personal moral judgment he used was that of the crying baby. So for example, imagine you're in a house and there are soldiers coming for you, and you have a baby and it's crying, and so you have the choice of either killing the baby, by covering its mouth, because it's going to smother him, but you're going to save you and the rest of your family, or you have the choice not to cover the mouth of the baby, so let it scream, so then you're not going to kill him, but then the soldiers are going to hear the baby, come into your house, kill you, and kill everyone else. So you either have the choice of killing one person to save many, but do a morally wrong action, or just do nothing, but everyone dies. And it's more difficult than just the footbridge element, because then you have to kill a baby. And he classified the responses to that difficult moral judgment into either utilitarian, so smothering the crying baby is judged appropriate, or non-utilitarian. Smothering the praying baby is just inappropriate because it's killing a baby, even though it's, in the end, everybody is going to die. And he imaged the brain of the participants. In those two analyses, first he just looked at what brain areas were activated by the difficult moral judgments as opposed to easy. And so what he found was that the difficult personal moral judgments, as opposed to easy personal moral judgments, would activate a brain area which is the anterior cingulate cortex, which is a brain area which is involved in conflict monitoring. So that validated his hypothesis that the personal moral judgments would activate kind of a conflict area in the brain, and it would thus validate his hypothesis that you have a conflict between emotions and reason. And he was actually missing something with just this analysis, and so he wanted to see if for example, the difference between people that make utilitarian choices, are they using a brain area which is associated with the reason compared to the others? And so that's what he did, and he found that that was the case. So people that make utilitarian choices in difficult judgments have an activation in the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex, which is associated with abstract reasoning and cognitive control. And this is as opposed to people who make non-utilitarian judgments. So if you're going to make a utilitarian choice in this difficult personal moral judgment, then you're activating this area, and then so you're using your reason. And so the main conclusion and synthesis of all this is that, according to Green, you have those two systems in the brain. One is an emotional brain. So the brain areas I showed you, there's also the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Also, studies showed that the amygdala was activated by personal moral judgments. So you have this emotional brain, which is in conflict with the rational brain, which is a DLPFC, so the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And here, missing it is the anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors a conflict between those two parts of the brain. And so when you're making your judgment, you have this conflict between reason and emotion, and depending on which judgment you're going to make, either based on reason or based on emotions, that's going to be seen in the different brain areas that are activated during the time when you make this judgment. So this is kind of a simple way to understand moral judgment in human beings, that you have emotions are going to favor a non-utilitarian judgment, which is based on actions, and if you use your reason, where you think more about the consequences of your actions, and then you make a different kind of judgment. But there are a few issues with those studies. I won't list them all. There are many of them, actually. But the first one is reverse inference, which was talked a bit about in the last course. So reverse inference is the action when you infer a mental state or a function just from the brain areas that are activated by a task. So in his studies, Green saw that personal moral judgments activated the anterior cingulate cortex, and so he concluded from that there was a conflict between two systems in the brain, and that's called reverse inference. And there are a few problems with this. Here I took examples for a brain area which is called the precuneus. There's a study that concluded that this area was involved in belief encoding, and if you actually look at several studies on that brain area, where they say very different things about what it might be implicated into. So the precuneus has, it's been thought to be involved in determining the precise location of relevant stimuli from various sensory modalities, also known to be implicated in visual spatial imagery, shifting attention between targets. It's activated during task switching. It's thought to reflect attentional demands when updating stimulus-response associations. So it's a bit confusing. And here the point is that you often can't really assign a single function to a brain region. So here, Green saw the activation of the ACC. He said, well, there's conflict, but it might have been something completely different because the ACC is not simply involved in conflict monitoring. It's involved in other things. The same is true for the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And so his interpretations might be wrong, and you can actually interpret this in a number of ways. And one of the other issues, and it's an interesting issue with this study, but also with other studies from the Western psychology field, is that it's focusing on what we call weird people, and it's actually an acronym which stands from Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic countries. So if you look at participants in psychology studies throughout the Western, the Western scientific community, often what researchers in psychology are going to do is that they're actually going to recruit from the universities they're in. So most participants are often undergraduates that often have to do this as a requirement for courses. And if you actually look in the methods of the papers I showed you, all the participants were undergraduates from a very prestigious university, and it's not obvious that those people are representative of the whole of humanity, and this is a problem because if you want to make conclusions about how human beings make moral decisions, and especially if you want to understand this, as I spoke about a bit earlier, to understand the differences, between how people from different groups are going to have clashes on moral issues, you want to have a sample which is representative of, the global population. So if you just focus on people from, rich universities in the United States, well, maybe what you're going to find will only be true for those people who often are outliers on a number of different measures, and so it might not be that interesting after all. And so there's work today to go towards a more diverse sampling of the participants in psychology studies, but that wasn't the case 20 years ago. And we have to keep this in mind when talking about those results. Now, to finish on this, dual process theory of moral thinking, I just want to show you a way to reinterpret those results, just to show you that often you don't have a single way to interpret results in psychology, in science, but in psychology especially. So I'll be short on this because it's a bit complicated. But this is an interpretation which uses results from the field of computer science, from artificial intelligence, from a field called reinforcement learning. This is an interpretation from a researcher who's called Molly Crockett. She's a researcher at MIT. She's also a very big name in the field of moral cognition. And so she focused on those two differences between the trolley scenario and what she calls the push scenario, which is the footbridge scenario I told you about. And according to her, you can explain differences, between the judgments you're going to have with those different scenarios by invoking the different systems in the brain that are used in what we call reinforcement learning. There's going to be a course on that. I don't remember when, but it's on the syllabus. There's going to be a course on reinforcement learning. But the basic idea is that, so reinforcement learning is learning through rewards. It's known that, in animals, but in human beings too, we can learn behaviors depending on the reward we're going to get. And it's believed that in the brain, there are several systems which are called model-free, model-based, and Pavlovian, which are implicated in this, learning from rewards and punishment. And according to Molly Crockett, you can explain the differences between the trolley and the footbridge scenario by essentially considering that those three systems are going to take a vote on the scenario you're in. And the action you're going to take is going to be a result of those votes. And according to her, so in the trolley scenario, two of the systems are going to vote, well, flip the switch, and just one system is going to vote to not flip the switch, and so you're going to flip the switch. But for the footbridge scenario, there's a difference in the way that this model-free system is going to respond to the scenario. And so this is going to shift the vote from this, global reinforcement learning system in the brain. And so it's going to vote the opposite, to take the non-utilitarian action, simply because there has been a different vote from that system in the brain. And, all of this is can be validated by some of the results that show that there are brain areas that are activated by those kinds of moral judgments that have been shown to be involved, to be part of those reinforcement learning systems in the brain. And so this has nothing to do with, it's not dual process theory, but it's still a theory that actually accounts for most of the results, most of the behavioral results quite well. So it's an alternative to Green's interpretation, and there are several others actually now. So I won't talk about all of them, but this is just an illustration of another interpretation, also interesting because it comes, from the field of computer science, and it accounts for the results in the same way, and even better than the interpretation from Joshua Green. Now, a final also reinterpretation I want to talk about. I won't delve into the details. Some people postulated that, Joshua Green's interpretation was a bit reductive, that you have this conflict between emotion and reason. Some people now believe that you have emotion and reason that work in tandem, with reason actually harnessing sometimes the emotions in different situations. This is called emotional regulation, where you have emotion and reason that work in tandem. And so I have a few references here if you want to check this out a bit more in detail. So here the basic idea is that you have rational systems, you have, cognitive strategies that use both reason and emotion in different kinds of moral judgments, such as, the trolley versus footbridge scenario. And so it's not that simple as emotions versus reason, according to those authors. So now, really quickly, I just want to go over a few potential practical applications of, all those results on moral cognition, how you might use this, this knowledge to maybe improve our, our moral behavior, or maybe try to resolve some conflicts and some issues that are very important today. And so I'm going to talk to you about mainly two issues. So the first application I'm going to talk about is how to use this information for normative theories. So how might you use this information to know what we should do? How you can use how people think to know how people should think. And it's not obvious at all. This is the normative prescriptive gap I told you about. I'm sorry, it's supposed to be descriptive prescriptive gap. The study of moral cognition is descriptive. It describes how people think and act morally, but how can it, teach us how we should be better moral agents? And so to make this point a bit clearer, that you can cross this gap, but it's not very obvious. We can focus on one question, which is a very important question in the field of normative ethical normative ethics, which is which moral beliefs are justified. So, how can you know which of your beliefs are going to be right or wrong? And the negative arguments against the use of the results from moral cognition to help us in knowing this is that to explain moral beliefs has nothing to do with justifying them. So it's not because that emotions underlie some moral beliefs that it makes them unjustified. The way to cross that gap is to add another moral premise. So you have to, if you want to use, for example, all those studies on emotions to help you know which moral beliefs are justified, you have to assume that, let's say that an emotional basis for a moral belief is disqualifying. And so if you add that, then if you know that some moral beliefs are underlined by emotions, then you can use that to say, those moral beliefs are not justified. And this is a way to use this is used by some philosophers. There's a lot of debate on this. I put a reference here for a discussion which is very comprehensive. But some philosophers think that if you can use those results from the studies on moral cognition to inform our knowledge of what is moral and what is not. And now the final application I also wanted to talk about, because it's it's very modern, is the issue of what we call machine ethics. So for example, with there's a lot of debate on autonomous cars, what decisions they have to make. Autonomous cars, since there are car accidents, at one point they will have to make a decision to either take an action and kill someone, or not take an action but kill someone else. And so there's a lot of work on this issue of knowing whether a machine could have a moral sense. And there's a guy called Moore who distinguishes two scenarios where you could have a weak artificial intelligence, which he calls implicit moral agents, which are machines that are programmed to behave ethically by its designers. So it will have, programmed behaviors that will make it behave differently in certain situations, but those are rules that were given to it by designers. And then you have strong AI, which are explicit moral agents, which are autonomous and can act following ethical principles by themselves. And so there's a lot of work to have this strong AI, to have machines that could make moral judgments without any external help. And so one way to do that will be to implement moral cognition, our understanding of moral cognition in those machines. But it's a lot more complicated than that. And so it's a lead, but there are a few issues with this way of doing things. Because first of all, we're not perfect moral agents. So it's not because the machine is going to think like a human that it's going to make perfectly moral decisions all of the time, because we don't make perfect moral decisions all of the time. And morality in human beings is very ambiguous, so that there's no clear codification of how you should act in a given situation. And there's also the risk that this artificial moral agents will incorporate the biases of human beings and of the people who design it. So there's a lot of work to, and we don't understand human moral cognition in the first place that well. So even if you had, a comprehensive understanding of how human beings think morally, that doesn't mean you could necessarily use it to make better machines. And there's actually another point which makes this a lot more complicated, which is that there's actually not a consensus about what the moral thing would be in a given scenario across the world. And there's a final study I want to talk about, and then I'll stop here, from Owen and colleagues that came out in 2018, where they designed a poll that they put on the internet, and they had thousands of participants from across the world. So obviously the United States, the Americas, Europe, a bit also in Asia, and they used this there's still a scenario where you have a self-driving car, and it's going towards 3 elder people who are illegally crossing the road. There's a stop sign, and they're not, that they're crossing, even though, the little guy is red. And so in the car you have a boy and its parents, and so the people were asked, well, should the car just continue and kill those people who are illegally crossing, or should it turn and kill the people in the car instead of those elderly people? So there are a lot of factors. They also varied the number of people in the car, the number of people here on the crossroads. They also varied the type of people that were crossing the road illegally. They put pets, criminals, and so they asked people from around the world to make decisions on those scenarios, and then they plotted the results, and they saw that they had widely varying decisions according to where people were from. So they were able to make 3 clusters. They had Western, Eastern, and Southern types of responses. And so, for example, people from the Western countries would prefer sparing humans. They had a preference for inaction, whereas, for example, people from Eastern countries had a preference for sparing the lawful. So, for example, a lot of people from those countries would actually say, well, even if those are elderly people, they're crossing the road illegally, so the car should kill them, because there is justification, a moral justification, for the car not to swerve and kill the people in the car. And so this is just to illustrate the point that there isn't any consensus on even what humans would do in those kinds of scenarios. And so it's a bit early to know what machines would do in that situation. And so even if we use results from the study of moral cognition to put in the machine, would we use moral cognition from Western people, from Southern people? The idea here is that moral cognition may be universal, but it's also affected by cultural factors, by political factors, and it would be inconceivable to put that into a machine to influence the way it's going to make those moral decisions. So people are thinking about this, but it's really complicated, and there is no clear answer about how you might use those kinds of results to have moral self-driving cars, essentially. So this is pretty much what I had to say. So here are some takeaways. Just summarizing what I've said in the past nearly 2 hours. So that morality likely evolved as a device for cooperation within groups and competition between groups, although it can be used for other things. So moral cognition is the study of the brain's role in moral judgment and behavior. It involves automatic, unconscious, and largely emotional processes, but also reason. And reason and emotions are likely working in tandem. There likely isn't this fight between emotions and reason that Green envisioned. And finally, the study of moral cognition might have some very concrete application in normative ethics, the morality of machines, as I've said, also the law. I haven't talked about this, but you can find some very interesting articles on this on the web. But even though there may be concrete applications, we still really don't fully know how to use those results in those fields. So I also put so all the references, all the articles I used are listed in this Google Docs. If you want to check it out, there are about 20 or 30 articles I used to prepare the course. Also, if you want some further reading on this, so I used this first book, Moral Tribes by Joshua Green, to prepare the lecture. It's a very, very clear book on both on our moral machinery, on moral cognition, but also on how we might use those results for normative ethics. Joshua Green was trained as a philosopher, so he has a lot of expertise in crossing this gap between descriptive and normative ethics. There's also a book by Jonathan Haidt, the founder of Moral Foundations theory. I haven't read it, but I hear it's a good book, and it's Moral Tribes and The Righteous Mind quote each other. Those are really, I'd say, the two books that are the most well-known on moral cognition that can be read by the general public. And then there's this Handbook of Neuroethics. It's a bit more specialized, and it's not exclusively on moral cognition. There's a lot of stuff on simply how what are the challenges associated with neuroscience today, the ethical challenges. Some of the references I've put in the Google Docs and that I use for the course are chapters from this book. So you can read it if you really want to learn more about this. And so that's it. Thank you for your attention. So if you have any questions, I can take them, and if you don't, I'm finished.
Oh, I was curious of something, but I would be more at ease when you cut the recording later.
You want me to cut the recording and?
Oh yeah, if you don't mind, if other people have any questions, just something that is a bit related, but not so much with the course. That's more.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to cut it.